When they canonized the Christian Bible, they were already deeply entrenched in replacement theology, and so they had to put the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, into the Christian Bible because it's quoted so often. But the church didn't really focus on it all that much because they said it was old, meaning done away with, and that is
Mhm.
replacement theology. So this Old New
Right.
Testament, even the names of the two portions of the Christian Bible, reinforces this idea of Christians being the new Israel. Israel is done away with, Israel is
Mhm.
abandoned by God, and all this other stuff, which isn't true.
Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a podcast from PJTN that focuses the light of truth on vital issues in today's headlines that impact every American. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza-Moore, founder and president of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, and I'm here to educate, motivate, and activate you to action. I want to arm you with the truth and the facts you'll need to fight and preserve our constitutional republic and uphold the Judeo-Christian values our nation was founded upon. Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a PJTN podcast, and I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza-Moore. On today's podcast, we're going to continue our conversation about the rise of replacement theology threat. I want to ask a question few are willing to ask. Why would Charlie Kirk, a conservative Christian influencer, platform anti-Semitic voices like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, who are promoting Greco-Roman replacement theology and blood libels under the guise of conservatism? We're witnessing in our generation a dangerous rise in rhetoric that divorces Christianity from its Hebraic foundations and replaces God's covenant with Israel with man-made national ideologies. This isn't just theological error. This is how anti-Semitism takes root in our churches and communities. Today, we're sounding the alarm and calling every Watchman to take a stand with us. To discuss this issue, I've invited Rabbanit Yaffa Batya da Costa, founder and CEO of Le'anusim, back on the podcast to continue our conversation about the Inquisition, anti-Semitism, and the role Christianity has played historically in fueling this ancient hatred. If you missed the last episode of our conversation with Yaffa, you can find it and our previous podcast lineup on our website at pjtn.org. salemsoneplace.com, as well as all the other platforms that you use to access your favorite podcasts. Yaffa, thank you for joining us once again on Proclaiming Justice. Last week we discussed Romans chapters 9 through 11. This week we're going to focus on Romans chapter 11. And I just want to tell you how grateful I am that you are continuing to take the time to walk us through this whole understanding, this teaching, to understand where Paul was coming from and why chapters 9 through 11 of the book of Romans is important for every Christian to understand. So welcome back.
Well, thank you so much, Laurie. I love doing these podcasts with you about this material in particular because I think it's so essential for people to understand, like you, believe that as well. And they're not being taught these things in most of the Christian world. I say most because there is a minority that are doing it, so I want to recognize them.
Right.
The pastors and the teachers in the Christian world that do know these things that we're talking about, but it's a very, very small minority. Wish there were more. So last session, we were talking about specifically chapter 11 of Romans, the letter to the Romans that Paul wrote. This was his last letter, I believe, that he wrote. He was in Rome. He had been accused of some things in Jerusalem. He said, wait a minute, I'm a Roman citizen. I want to appeal to the emperor. So that's why he was in Rome. So we ended this chapter 11 segment of Paul talking about the olive tree. It's a metaphor that he uses. And we didn't quite finish. There's a couple more verses that are really, really essential at the end, starting with verse 23. And I really encourage our audience to go to the book yourself, the Bible, and read it for yourself. Don't take my word for it. But Paul writes, and if they, he's talking about the natural branches, if they, because they were cut off earlier, it said that some were cut off, okay?
Right.
He goes, and if they, meaning the natural branches, do not persist in unbelief, and Paul's talking about unbelief in God,
Right.
okay? They will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. God cut them off, okay, and God can graft them in again, and it's got to do with belief in him. And then verse 24, it says, after all, if you, and he's talking to the Gentiles, okay, in Romans. So he says, after all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that's wild by nature, and that's the expression he uses for the Gentiles, if you were cut out of an olive tree that's wild by nature and contrary to nature were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, that's the olive tree that represents Israel, okay?
Right.
How much more readily will these, meaning the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree, be grafted back in if they change their unbelief to be belief? Now, talk about Paul as a Jew and as a Pharisee, which we're going to get to later. He's using an argument called kal v'chomer. Kal v'chomer is an argument in Jewish literature in terms of interpretation of Jewish texts. It's a principle of reasoning that draws a conclusion from a less stringent case to a more stringent one, based on the idea that if something is true in a simpler or a lesser situation, it must certainly be true in a more complex or more significant context. So Paul is saying if they were cut off from their own natural tree, these natural branches, if they were cut off, how much more so can they be grafted back in?
Right.
Because
Good
it's
point.
unnatural to take a branch from an olive tree that's wild by nature and graft it into a cultivated olive tree. Now, people who know about grafting, they know that this is true. So it just makes a lot of sense that it's not that all the Jewish people were cut off, first of all. And second of all, the reason they got cut off, which I explained in prior sessions with you, it's got nothing to do with their belief in Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah. It had to do with their rebellion against God. And I think I demonstrated that the last time.
Right. Absolutely. So, yes. And this is an important point to make because it's why even in the Gospels, people who do not keep the commandments and do not observe the Torah were considered not keeping God's law, not keeping his commandments. And we're even taught in the New Testament scriptures that if anyone teaches others not to obey these commandments, then they will be called least in the kingdom.
That's what Jesus said, correct. And by the way, in Judaism, which of course Jesus was a Jew, Paul was a Jew, they were both Pharisees. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But the thing is that when he talks about they'd be least in the kingdom, it's because their sin is so great. Why? Because not only are they sinning themselves, but they're influencing other people to commit the sin as well.
That's right.
So that's a double hit. And when we encourage people to do a good thing, we get a portion of the merit of what they do. It's us, anybody, okay? Because we've encouraged someone to do a good deed or do a mitzvah, we say, okay? But if we're encouraging someone to sin, even just by our example, we're not telling them to do anything, it's just, even our example is inspiring them to do something that's against God's will, which is called a sin, of course.
Right.
Then it's a double hit on us because not only are we doing a sin, but we're encouraging, even more so if we're telling them to do it, we're encouraging others to sin. It's a double sin, in other words.
Yeah, by our example, when we don't live according to the Torah, according to the writings, according to the prophets. So this is very important for our audience to understand. And I think our audience does have a good grasp on this. But for that clarification, that people understand that, Jesus did not come to abolish the commandments or the Torah. He came to uphold them. And to uphold something doesn't mean to abolish it or eliminate it. It means to uphold it.
Right, exactly. He said he came to fill it full or fulfill, either way you want to say it. And then he goes, not one jot or tittle, one
Right.
small little mark on a Torah scroll is what that means, will go away
Mm-hmm.
unless heaven and earth were to go away. So, and I'm paraphrasing. So we're going to talk about Jesus of Nazareth and his view of the law, okay, and things that he said or he's quoted as saying. I mean, we don't really know what Jesus said. We only know what people quoted him as saying.
Right. I think that's an important point also. People have to understand that when Jesus was walking on the earth, there was no New Testament Bible.
Right.
It was only all they had was the Tanakh, the scrolls, the Torah, the writings, the prophets. That's all they had to read from. When he went to the synagogues to study and reason with the others, it was over the Tanakh. It wasn't.
He
It
wasn't
wasn't.
reading Paul's letters?
No, there were no Paul's letters yet. So this is important for us to understand. And I don't think a lot of people really think through that. They think that, because we have the Old Testament and the New Testament scriptures, back then they didn't. All they had was the Tanakh, which Christians would call the Old Testament.
Later, when they canonized the Christian Bible, and it was in the 5th century, I believe, 4th or
Mm-hmm.
5th, either one, they were already deeply entrenched in replacement theology that Christians are the new Israel and all of that
Mm-hmm.
business. And so they had to put the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, into the Christian Bible because it's quoted so often. I mean, how would people know what was being quoted when it says Jeremiah this or Ezekiel that or whatever?
Correct.
So they had to put it there, but they didn't really, the church didn't really focus on it all that much because they said it was old, meaning done away with, and that is
Mm-hmm.
replacement theology. So this Old New
Right.
Testament, even the names of the two portions of the Christian Bible reinforces this idea of Christians being the new Israel. Israel is done away with. Israel is
Mm-hmm.
abandoned by God and all this other stuff, which isn't true.
Yeah. It's why I always teach my students that in order to understand the New Testament writings, it has to be read through a Hebraic lens. Because we know, after all, the original followers were Jewish. They read Hebrew, they spoke in Hebrew.
Right. They spoke in Hebrew and Aramaic, both at that time, 1st century, both. Okay. They had to know Hebrew in order to read the Hebrew Bible. Okay. And they also spoke Aramaic. The other thing people don't understand is the Gospels were written, if you look at Mark, who most Christian scholars believe was the first gospel to be written, it was written right after, relatively soon after the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common
Mm-hmm.
Era. That's
Mm-hmm.
40 years after Jesus of Nazareth died. 40
Mm-hmm.
years. And then the other
Mm-hmm.
Gospels were written in the 80s, 85, 90, and John is the last one written between 9 and 110 of the Common Era. So these are all written way, way, later than when
Right.
Jesus and his disciples were walking around. And the names given, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, were given by the early church, okay, because in the beginning they were only called the evangelists, and we don't really know who wrote them. And I'm talking about Christian scholars saying this.
Right.
I'm
Right.
Jewish, but I mean, I read Christian scholars and I listen to James Tabor and Bart Ehrman and some of these
Mm-hmm.
other guys, who are pretty well known in this field and others, and of course, and they say everybody admits nobody really knows who wrote these. So if the words of Jesus were carried down through those years
Mm-hmm.
orally, well, the oral Torah was done orally as well, so it's not an objection, okay?
And that's
But,
not an oddity either, because there is the oral Torah.
right,
So thank you for making that point.
right. So it's not to criticize it that it was oral, but they chose. what to put in those letters or documents called Gospels. And maybe they didn't put everything in that they might have put in, okay? And they were certainly influenced. I contend, and others as well, contend that they were heavily, heavily influenced by the Roman-Jewish War from 66 to 73, the destruction of the Second Temple and the killing of about 1 million people in Jerusalem. 1 million. Okay, and this struck fear in the hearts of all the Jews in Judea and in the Galilee. So people need to understand that Roman occupation and the Roman-Jewish War is a very heavy-duty context that most don't recognize or don't put these writings of the first century into that context to understand it better.
So where would our audience be able to find more information about that war? Would that be Josephus?
That would be Josephus.
Yeah.
He's the one that most people point to. There are some other ones lesser famous, but absolutely, he wrote the book about the Roman-Jewish wars because there were two. There was one 66 to 73 of the Common Era, and then 132 to 135 during the time of Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kokhba, who Rabbi Akiva thought was the Jewish Messiah at that time. And he was killed. So it's like that. There were two Roman. And then after that Roman-Jewish War, the Jews were exiled by the Romans and they renamed it Palestina or Philistina or whatever.
So that's where that came from. I think it's important. I just want to reiterate this to the audience. It's important to note that we need to study history and biblical history because it's one of the reasons why we are biblically and historically illiterate. Even today, we don't have a full knowledge because, unfortunately, within Christianity, when you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior and you come into the Christian faith, there is no history lesson. The Christian church doesn't teach Christians about the history of Christianity. So it's important that we read the Bible from the beginning. And it's also important that we study some of the historical writings like Josephus as we're going through and studying the Bible so that we put everything in its proper context. That eliminates the confusion and the lack of understanding. So when we have these conversations with other Christian leaders like Tucker Carlson and Charlie Kirk and others, Candace Owens, I don't know about her. I think she's lost and she's fallen off the deep end. But it's important that we understand so that when we are able to, whether it's through social media, whether it's through putting out emails and communicating with family and friends, we have this understanding because we have been studying and reading. And so I so appreciate you taking the time again, Yaffa, to walk us through this, to navigate through this process, to help us put the Bible in its proper context and the covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the grafting in to the Commonwealth of Israel.
Right. No, you're welcome. You're entirely welcome. It's so important and it's so needed. And I just have a passion as an educator. I've been an educator over 50 years in the business world and then 30 years in this world and did, Jewish-Christian interfaith dialogue and all of this stuff for a few years. But here's the thing. You mentioned last segment that we did that someone said to you, they didn't know or they didn't think, or somebody said Jesus was not a Jew or something like that.
Correct.
Well, they think the same thing of Paul. Paul was the first Christian. If they don't think Jesus was the first Christian, they think Paul was the first Christian. Paul was a Jew. So I just want to share with you some things about Paul, okay? Because he is the main writer of, and then we know it was Paul. This is not somebody putting Paul's name on some documents. Okay, we know for sure these, and there are only 7 of the 14 that are attributed to Paul. Modern Christian scholars say only 7 were actually written by Paul. The others are either disputed or outright they reject them, like the letter to the Hebrews is absolutely rejected as written by Paul. So that's just an example. We can talk more about that some other time. But in the book of Acts, there's an awful lot of information about Paul. Now, this was written by somebody called Luke. Okay, So we don't know who he was. They think he was a companion of Paul. But it specifically says that Paul is portrayed as participating in temple rituals and fulfilling a Nazirite vow alongside other Jews, showing his commitment to Jewish law, customs, and practices. My goodness. Paul? Now, by the way, Nazirite is a commandment of God, and I'm going to get to that. It's in the Torah. Okay? So the book of Acts talks about this. And what it is specifically is that there's this thing called temple purification. Paul is in Jerusalem and he's talking to the leaders of the Nazirite sect of Jews. They were called Nazarenes. Okay, sorry, I said Nazirite. I meant Nazarenes. And Paul was a member of that community. He was a Nazarene himself. And so they told Paul, they said, there's a rumor about you that you're telling Jews not to observe the law. They mean the Torah.
Right.
Okay, so we can start at Acts chapter 21, verse 20. And they praised Paul for all that he was doing with the Gentiles, etc., because he gave them a full report. So it starts with that. And then they say, and they said to Paul, you see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. Okay? These
Oh,
are among the
yeah, so break that one down right there. The thousands, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law, the Torah?
Right. And then it goes on to say, they've been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. So when they say customs, they're talking about oral law. Okay, halacha
Right.
in Hebrew. Okay. So the next verse, 22, says, what shall we do? They will certainly hear that you've come, meaning to Jerusalem. So do these people who have heard this rumor about Paul, okay? So they say, so do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Okay, now it's talking about the Nazirite vow. There are people who can take on a vow called the Nazirite vow, okay, where they're not going to drink wine or eat grapes. They're not going to cut their hair, okay? And there's a third thing, I'll get to it in a minute in my notes here. But in Acts chapter 21, verse 24, it says, take these men, I think it's 4 men, who are now going to do a purification ritual to stop their vow. They've completed their vow. Maybe they took the vow for 6 months or a year or whatever. It says, take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved because their hair was long. Then everyone will know there's no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. Okay? Very clear.
Right.
Verse 26, the next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. So he didn't just pay their expenses, he did it with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end and the offering that would be made for each of them. And that's what he paid. He paid for these offerings, okay, they're done at the end of their purification ritual. So Paul financed the purification of 4 men who had taken a Nazirite vow, further illustrating his own adherence to Jewish practices. Okay. Now, in Acts chapter 24, this is so important. This is like incredibly important. Chapter 24, verse 14. I just want to home in on this verse. It says, it quotes Paul stating, quote, but this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, and he's talking about the Nazarenes, so I worship the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets. Unquote. Now, the Nazarene sect were called Nazarenes, but you know what they were also called? The Way. Okay? Hebraic in Hebrew. That was one of the names for this group. So when Jesus says, and people quote this a lot, okay, Jesus of Nazareth saying, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, those are all words used for Torah. And what he means by that is follow the way that I'm teaching you, which he's talking about the halacha, or the customs of the house of Hillel, because we have these two houses of Pharisees. This is what this context, a lot of people don't understand this or know this.
Right.
They've never been taught. There's the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel. Paul was also from the house of Hillel, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. Okay, but Jesus also taught from the standpoint of the house of Hillel. Okay? So throughout Acts, Paul identifies himself as a Jew, as a Pharisee, and emphasizing his connection to Jewish heritage and beliefs. And then you have this whole chapter in Acts called Acts 15, chapter 15, the Jerusalem Council. Okay, and it addresses the question of whether the Gentile believers, believing in God now, again, every time it says believers, unless it says something specific like believing in Jesus or whatever, okay, it's talking about believing in God, whether the Gentile believers need to be circumcised or not, and to keep the law or not. Now, circumcision is a shorthand way of saying convert and become a Jew and keep the whole law.
Right.
Not the 10 Commandments and not the moral code, but the whole law, all 613 commandments. Circumcision is a shorthand for saying that.
Right. And its circumcision is also the sign between God and his people. And that's correct.
Right, exactly. So if people want to know what the council decided, now this is the Jerusalem Council of the Nazarene sect, because that's what they're called. Even in Jewish history, they're called the Nazarene sect. The council decides that the Gentiles are not obligated to follow the entirety of Jewish law, all 613 commandments, but they should abstain from certain practices like eating food sacrificed to idols, and this decision does not negate the law for Jews, but rather clarifies the requirements for Gentile believers. So again, people have to know who's talking or who's writing, okay? Who are they writing to, okay? Paul writes to the Gentiles. He's the apostle to the Gentiles, okay? And not take what he says to the Gentiles or about the Gentiles and apply it to the Jews. It doesn't work. It's not logical. So, and then Paul is known for his emphasis on faith in God and through the teachings of Jesus. So when Paul says in Jesus Christ, the word there in the Greek can be translated in, or it can be translated through. And if it's through Jesus, it really means his teachings. Okay? In context of what he taught, because he taught Torah. So his own actions, Paul's actions, demonstrate that he himself didn't abandon Jewish law. He himself, as a Jew, did not abandon Jewish law with the purification ritual and the Nazirite vow. Just those two. There are other things. Okay? Now, one more thing, and then I'll let you ask me anything you like. The Nazirite vow is in Torah, of course. It's in Numbers chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. If they just start with that, I think the whole chapter might be about the Nazirite vow. But I'll give you the first 4 verses. The Lord, meaning Hashem, said to Moses, quote, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them," subquote, "if a man or a woman wants to make a special vow, a vow of dedication to the Lord as a Nazirite, they must abstain from wine and other fermented drink, and must not drink vinegar made from wine or other fermented drink. They must not drink grape juice or eat grapes or raisins, as long as they remain under their Nazirite vow," which they take it on, by the way, voluntarily. "As long as they remain under their Nazirite vow, they must not eat anything that comes from the grapevine, not even the seeds or the skins." And then it goes on, talks more about Nazirite vow, and just briefly, they're not allowed to cut their hair and they're not allowed to go near a corpse. So people can read that whole chapter for themselves. It's very, very clear what was commanded if someone wants to take this vow.
So there is a question I have for you. You talked previously about the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. and that Jesus taught from the house of Hillel, and so did Paul. What are the differences for our audience? If you could explain what was the difference between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai? I think this is really important for Christians to understand because it's also reflective of what Jesus was teaching and what he believed.
Absolutely. If you want a full list, your audience, I should say, there's an excellent book that was written by an Orthodox rabbi called Jesus the Pharisee. And again, most Christian scholars who take Jesus and what he's quoted as saying, and Paul as well, take them to be Pharisees of the house of Hillel. Okay. It's because the so-called arguments or discussions between Jesus and the so-called Pharisees of his day that's written in the Gospels, okay, it's very clear the topic that they're discussing and the arguments that they're having. Jesus is taking the position of Hillel, and those Pharisees, he calls them Pharisees, which is true, they are, but they're taking the position of Shammai, of the house of
Mm-hmm.
Shammai. Okay. Now, Paul says he's a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees in Acts 23, verse 6. And further, that he studied under the prominent Pharisee teacher Gamaliel, the elder. He says
Right.
that in Acts 22, 3. So there are these two different schools of the Pharisees, okay? And so there's a tradition, because the men themselves, Hillel and Shammai, lived about 100 years before Jesus, but their schools carried on their teachings. Now, here's an example. He says in Acts 22, 3, Paul states, I'm a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in the city, he's talking about Jerusalem, at the feet of Gamaliel, educated according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as
Mm-hmm.
all of you are this day. Okay. And let me give an example of where they differed. Paul has an emphasis on grace and the inclusion of Gentiles in God's kingdom, and certainly in his communities, as you know
Mm-hmm.
very well. So he more closely identifies with the house of Hillel on that matter. But the
Mm-hmm.
house of Shammai did not agree with this inclusion of Gentiles in Jewish communities. Okay. And they were known for being more strict and having a more strict interpretation of Jewish law and practice for the most part. There's
Mm-hmm.
some, actually, there's some exceptions. There's always an exception, right? There are some exceptions where they're more lenient, but for the most part, Beit Shammai, the house of Shammai, was more strict in Jewish law and practice, often advocating on this issue even greater separation from Gentiles than the more lenient Hillel.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Hillel in general is more lenient. Again, there are some exceptions where Hillel is more stringent or strict. Okay, but
Mm-hmm.
in general, Hillel is more lenient. Shammai is more strict. Okay, and so Paul was taught under a Pharisee of the house of Hillel who was the grandson of Hillel, even.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So people don't know these things. And so they see the quotes of Jesus against the Pharisees and think, oh, well, he's against all Pharisees and he's against the law. And it's not true at all.
Very interesting. So, what would you? I know there's several different types of Judaism or synagogues. What would you? Is there a specific Judaism or synagogue that would lean toward the house of Hillel, and what would be its counter for the house of Shammai in modern day?
So what happened historically, and this is written up, people can go to the internet and use their favorite search engine to find articles about Hillel and Shammai. But what happened historically was while Jerusalem was under siege by the Romans, there was this man named Yochanan ben Zakkai, okay, who slipped out of Jerusalem. They took him out in a coffin, I think. Okay, but he had the permission of the Romans to leave.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the thing was, In that day, Shammai was more numerous. The people who believed in the interpretation of Shammai was more numerous, and Hillel was the minority. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yochanan ben Zakkai leaves Jerusalem and he goes to Yavne, which is a city in Israel, to the southwest of Jerusalem, towards the Mediterranean, and he starts a school there, yeshiva. And the history books say that he got a voice from heaven. It's called a bat kol. Got a voice from heaven saying, the words of Shammai are the words of Hashem, and the words of Hillel are the words of Hashem, but the halacha, the ruling, will follow Hillel.
Hmm.
So after that, and of course there was great destruction, I should say, and lots of people slaughtered, okay, in the Roman-Jewish War. But after that, and there's another story about, there was a meeting of the Sanhedrin. They went to visit someone who was sick, and the rabbis who went to this meeting, who were part of the Sanhedrin, the majority at that time was Shammai, and they passed a few laws of halacha, okay, oral tradition, whatever, according to their view. So
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a subset that follows Shammai, and the
Mm-hmm.
majority of the halacha today in the Jewish world, in the Orthodox world, Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, whatever it is, they follow mostly Hillel. So
Mm.
let me put it to you like this. This blows my mind when I first realized this. Jesus taught from the position of Hillel, which was a minority. The numbers of people who followed Hillel in his day was the minority. Okay. And Jesus has this parable where he says, a father owned a vineyard. I'm paraphrasing. A father owned a vineyard and he had two sons. And he said to the first son, go and work in the vineyard. And the son said no, but later he did. And he said to the second son, go work in the vineyard. And the son said yes, but he didn't. So which one followed the will of the father?
Mm.
Well, the first one, initially he said no, but then he did. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And what blows me away is initially the Jewish people in his day, did not want to accept Jesus' teachings. Most of them followed the house of Shammai. But after the destruction of the temple and Yochanan ben Zakkai and his yeshiva, and they get this voice from heaven saying, predominantly the halacha is going to be by Hillel, and they start following Hillel. They start following what also Jesus was teaching.
Mm.
So they're like the first son who initially said, no, I don't want to go along with you because I'm following Shammai. Okay, but later the Jewish people followed Hillel, starting with after the destruction of the Second Temple. Can you believe this?
Wow.
So the Jewish people
Wow.
today follow
Mm-hmm.
the Torah according also to what Jesus taught. And the Christian world is teaching don't follow the Torah at all, and the Jews are done away with. And of course, God made an eternal covenant with the Jews. No one can change
Mm-hmm.
that covenant except God
Mm-hmm.
who made it,
Right.
right? And the Christians aren't following Torah, but they don't have to, so don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying they have to, but they want to obliterate Torah from the whole world altogether,
Mm-hmm.
right? And yet Jesus taught from the Torah, he taught from the house of Hillel, which was more lenient than the house of Shammai.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it all makes a lot of sense, but it blows my mind that people aren't being taught these things.
It's what keeps the separation between Christians and Jews. And you're right. It's because in Christianity we've been teaching that the law is bad instead of understanding that when you see the word law in the Bible, it refers to Torah. And what is Torah? It is instruction. So the Torah is our instruction as to how to live our lives, but we have Christian leaders, Christians who've gone through seminaries who are taught that the law is done away with. It's no longer, excuse me, it's no longer valid. It's no longer needed. And my question to these theologians who have led all these sheep astray, my question to them is then what law did Jesus come to teach? Because if he came to teach a law, what is it? And if the 10 commandments are no longer valid because they're in the Torah, then which one are we going to break? Well, we know we're breaking the Sabbath right off the bat. But look at the other 10 commandments. Which ones? Are we going to commit adultery? Are we going to kill? These are all the most important questions we have to understand as we're studying the Bible. We cannot, as I said earlier, for our audience, and of course, Yaffa, we're going to have you come back again because there's still so much more that we didn't cover yet. But as I tell my students, if you don't connect the New Testament scriptures back to the Torah or to the writings or to the prophets, how can you trust that what is written there is true? If we can go back, a matter is confirmed before a cloud of 2 to 3 witnesses. Well, who are the witnesses? Who are the witnesses to the New Testament writings? It has to be the Torah. It has to be the prophets. It has to be the writings that testify.
But only in the first century, because as you know so well, my dear friend Laurie, after the first century, we have the second century, where you have the writings of the so-called church fathers who were
Right.
Greco-Roman and anti-Semitic, and the
Yeah.
Christian church has had to, over the years, try to, but not succeed at, reconciling the conflict between what the church fathers wrote and what the first century writers wrote.
Right.
Okay. And there's a lot of conflict and contradiction there if you really understand the first century, especially Paul. If you
Mm-hmm.
really put Paul in the context of his day as a Jew, as a Pharisee, following the teachings of Hillel. And I have one more verse for people to look up as another example of Paul, okay, in support of the law, terrible law, is First
Mm-hmm.
Corinthians chapter 7, okay,
Mm-hmm.
verses 17 to 20. And here Paul writes, quote, "This is my rule in all the churches," as actually in the Greek, it's ecclesia, it's the communities, it's the, congregation, okay? "This is my rule in all the congregations. Was anyone at the time of his call, when God called him, already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of
Mm-hmm.
circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision," which is a euphemism for convert to Judaism. "Let each of you remain in the condition which you were called."
Mm-hmm.
That's another
Mm-hmm.
proof that
Right.
Paul was not telling Jews to not follow the Torah.
Right. 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 Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Yaffa, we're just going to have you back next week to be continued. Ladies and gentlemen, if any of you are interested in doing a Bible study, PJTN does do a Bible study on Saturdays and on Sundays. Just email me at info@pjtn.org. If you want to learn how to study to go deeper than the surface of what we're learning within our churches, I'd like to help take you there, and that way, all this wonderful knowledge that you're getting from Yaffa right now, you'll be able to apply because you'll understand everything in context. So, Yaffa, again, thank you for joining us. We look forward to having you back on the program. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found this program informative. We're going to post this podcast on our website and all of our podcast platforms so that you can share with your family and friends. We have to put our Bibles back into their proper context. As PJTN Watchmen, we are biblically mandated to stand against this ungodly rising Nazi threat that is destroying this nation and other Western nations, threatening our Judeo-Christian values and promoting anti-Semitism. We cannot remain silent. God warned the prophet Ezekiel that if you see the enemy advancing, you are to warn the people of the city so that they can prepare. If any innocent blood is shed, it's going to be required of the watchman. You too, ladies and gentlemen, can sound the alarm. You can warn others just by simply sharing this podcast with your family and friends. So please share and like and help sound the alarm in your community. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of my favorite theologians to quote from, reminded us that silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. Don't forget to join us for next week's podcast as we continue our conversation with Yaffa. And I also want to remind you that if you have not signed up to become a PJTN Watchman, You can help support this mission through our award-winning documentaries and Focus on Israel programs, as well as more programs just like this one for just $20 a month. So go to our website at pjtn.org to watch our programs and listen to our past podcasts. Your generous monthly donation will ensure that PJTN remains on the front lines and in the headlines, but we can't do it without your faithful prayers and financial support. I hope that you will prayerfully consider supporting our mission as we educate to activate Jews, Christians, and all people of conscience to stand on the front lines of this all-encompassing war. God bless you, and thank you for all you do. On behalf of our Jewish brethren, the State of Israel, and these United States. Thank you again for joining me on this edition of Proclaiming Justice. Please share this podcast with your family and friends. For more information about how you can get involved, please visit our website at pjtn.org. As a PJTN Watchman, you can help us keep up the fight to preserve our freedom for our children and their children for such a time as this.